Are these stories real? Please, you tell us. What I mean is, did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? Giant Alaskan Dogman versus giant feral Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a pretty wild story that's been told in my family since the 1950s. I got to hear it firsthand from my grandfather himself back in the 1980s. It happened to him personally, at least the way he would tell it. It not only has a dogman in it, but it has Bigfoot as well. Another thing about this story is that it's Texas-sized, even though it takes place in Canada, just east of Alaska. I first found out about all this because when I was a kid, I had a real interest in Bigfoot. I hadn't heard of Dogman, but we lived in the Pacific Northwest, and Bigfoot was all the rage during the 70s and 80s. One time, my father mentioned that his father had seen something like a Bigfoot once, way back in the 1950s. It was in the summer when Dad told me about it, but Grandpa didn't visit till Thanksgiving, so I had to wait till then to finally hear the tale myself. It was worth the wait, as far as I was concerned. So according to Grandpa, he was driving home to Northway Junction back in Alaska, where he lived at the time. He was in the vicinity of Clue Lake in Canada, driving northwest, when the sighting happened. It was night, and it was dark. There are no lights on that highway, it's just a two-lane blacktop. Trees on either side for farther than the eye can see. No other traffic in sight, and a real lonely feeling began settling in. This was the 1950s, remember? When you were alone, you were really alone. Isolated. There are places where the trees are sparser and then patches where it gets really thick and comes closer to the road. Well, Grandpa was coming up on one of the thicker patches on his right, and he saw the strangest sight he had seen up to that point. It would soon be topped, but what he saw then was the uppermost branches of the trees shaking, with leaves flying up in the air and drifting back down. What could be doing that? From his vantage point, he couldn't really judge that it was heading toward the road until he saw two 20-foot tall behemoth monsters fall out of the woods, tumbling over each other. Some cryptid encounters are discounted because they could have been a man in a suit. This story might be explained a lot of different ways, but these were not men in monster costumes. Grandpa was busy arresting the forward momentum of his vehicle, but the disturbance was significantly far away, and his car souped up enough that he was able to slow down, stop, then back up and park half off the road with his headlights pointed up at the spectacle in front of him. Gramps said his jaw was slack as he tried to understand what he was seeing. His first thought was, Mighty Joe Young is real, but after some time, he saw enough to notice that only one of the two appeared ape-like. The other was either an oversized bear or an oversized dog. Grandpa said you can find the spot where the fight took place if you could find the spot where the asphalt is cracked. This is because the ape-like one, which I think was a Bigfoot, body slammed the giant dogman or wolfman into the highway, causing that crack in the pavement. I asked him if that was the killing blow, but Grandpa just laughed. He said that big dog just shook it off and went for the hairy caveman's throat. The Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, or whatever it was, battled like a wrestler, according to Grandpa. The dog acted like a dog. It tried to tear the other one's throat out. It scratched at him with his claws, which were long and sharp and shaped like a raccoon's paws more than a dog's. Grandpa insisted that after they rolled around for a while on the highway, They became separated, and then each of them stood up, not on all fours, but on its hind legs. I gave him a skeptical look. The dog stood up the same as the Bigfoot did? Gramps insisted that was what had happened. He said it looked like some kind of a werewolf, but bigger, and he didn't think this one was going to change back into Lon Chaney afterward. I started suspecting that this was all made up, and he could see it in my eyes. I believed in Bigfoot back then. I had never heard of a giant dog that stood up bipedally, though. Shrugging his shoulders, Grandpa said maybe it was a kind of a bear, I don't know. Then he got annoyed and asked me why I believed I saw a 20-foot-tall Sasquatch, but not a 20-foot-tall dog. At least we know dogs exist. He asked me, were they both pretty unbelievable ideas? He insisted they were to him. After all, he'd never seen such a thing before, and he's never seen anything like it since. If you ask me, he confided, once a story has a 20-foot-tall ape man in it, hold on tight because now anything can happen. I didn't see it that way because I had read books about Bigfoot and watched documentaries about Bigfoot, and to me, Bigfoot was a real creature and most definitely something to expect while driving through the Yukon at night. Again, I had never heard of a dogman in those days, so that was the part I had trouble with. I wasn't seeing it from the point of view of a regular guy like my grandfather. I was seeing it from the point of view of a monster geek. I asked him if he thought of the Bigfoot as an animal or a person. Which way did he feel about it? He gave me a look and asked me if I had ever seen a 20-foot-tall person. Then we both laughed. I explained that some hunters have said they couldn't pull the trigger because they weren't sure the Sasquatch wasn't human. I asked him what he would have done if he was armed, and Grandpa laughed again, saying he would have needed a cannon to make a dent in either of those two behemoths. So Grandpa said the fight went on for a while and got pretty nasty before the Bigfoot ran away, swinging through trees to his left. The dogman was on his heels, slamming into trees and knocking some over. Grandpa said he was able to bring friends back to the spot several times over the next month or two by looking for the smashed tree cover on both sides. Of course, by the next summer you couldn't notice it any longer, and then you would only have the crack in the highway with which to identify the location. It was years later, years after Grandpa had left us, when I finally had a chance to recreate his journey, driving up through Canada to Alaska along that narrow old highway. I hit the area during the day since I'm curious, but I'm not as brave as he was. Well, I found cracks on the road all right. A whole lot of them. I couldn't really locate a spot I could say with confidence was the correct location. Of course, this was around 2010, which would have been something like 55 years after it was supposed to have happened. I'm sure that old road has seen some wild events in all that time. If my grandpa was really telling the truth, then it's probably seen more battles like the one he witnessed. In my family, this story happened. Nobody questions it, as Grandpa was not known to exaggerate often. If this was a tall tale, it was his only tall tale. That's what my dad said. I suppose I'm the only one in my entire clan that isn't 100% certain that Grandpa actually witnessed a knockdown, drag-out fight between giant Alaskan Dogman versus giant feral Bigfoot. Hey guys, I know you only want to hear about scary stuff, but some of you know I do animation to help make money and keep this show on the air, also because I love making cartoons. One of them I've been privileged to work on is Gary Sohmers' rock opera, The Beasties. Gary's known for being the king of pop culture from Antiques Roadshow, but he was in bands before he did any of that, and now he's returning to his roots with this project. Since they haven't been able to perform the rock opera due to the pandemic, Gary's been hiring singers, actors, and animators to begin making it into a video experience song by song. I got to direct and animate the song Only the Cool Succumb, which we linked to in our description. He's got some brilliant people working on this, like famous Disney animator Philo Barnhart and Chris Farlow, who Mick Jagger used to produce the records of. So, Gary asked me to show you his merch page on Teespring, which I'll also link to in the description. See, it's my cartoon characters on stuff like, oh wow, my dinosaur on the crotch of underpants. Oh no, wait, that's a that's a face mask, sorry. It's still exciting, but it covers a different part of you. Wait, what is a neck goiter? That sounds nasty, actually. Ooh, look, my punk character climbing up that woman's leg. There's the sheep dancing with the wolf in sheep's clothing. Stuff, more stuff. Oh, look, a tampon. Oh, no, wait, that's an iPhone case. Same thing. What's that, toilet paper? No, another neck goiter. That's not underpants either. It's a fanny pack. No tighty whities. There's a wife beater. There's a pink wife beater, so I guess that's maybe a husband beater. And on and on. You get the point. So check it out if you are so inclined. And now, it's time for our next tale, which we call... I think my father saw a lizard man. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Recently, my parents have been trying to figure out how to get along with me. It's well-intentioned, but always lame and clumsy. They found out I watch your show, so my mother told me that my father got in a fight with a Bigfoot one time. I rolled my eyes because I was sure she was making it up just to try to make my dad seem cool to me or whatever. But when my dad came home that night, I asked him directly about it, and he gave me his side of it. First of all, my father said he did not get into a fight with a Bigfoot. My mother started objecting and insisting that he had, but he interrupted her and reminded her this took place 2 years before she married him, and she was not there on that night. I asked him why he waited till I was almost 21 to tell me the story if it was true. He said it was the scariest thing that ever happened to him, and he didn't really want me to know how bad the world can get. So he lied to me and told me that Santa Claus did exist, but Bigfoot did not. He held his head down and admitted he didn't know if he did the right thing by me. It might have been better to be more honest. Maybe I wouldn't be ready to accept reality now that it was my time to become a man. Maybe, he said, maybe I thought I was going to live forever in a fantasy world where everything is nicey-nicey and all stories have a happy ending. I was surprised to hear that from him since I never thought of my dad as being protective of me before. To be honest, I thought he was kind of a hard ass, but I suppose he was a lot softer on me than his old man had been on him. Dad said this was about 25 years ago, back in the mid-1990s. He was driving a truck down south, which was a job I never heard about before. He was in the middle of making a long drive from Florida up north, and he was passing through one of the Carolinas, he told me. Then he stopped talking and stared off into the distance for a while, thinking. It might have been Georgia, he said finally. I just remember I was down south and it was a really hot night, even though it was October. It was swampy off the sides of the road. He suggested I Google for swamps and maybe that would be where the story happened. So, somewhere in South Carolina, North Carolina, or maybe Georgia, late at night, surrounded by swamps and gators or crocs and probably skunk apes, my father was driving some kind of big old truck. A 16-wheeler or 18-wheeler or whatever they call them. My father is a college professor, so this was news to me that he once drove one of those giant trucks. I have to say, I want to find out more about it. I wonder if I could handle it. I wonder if Dad wasn't handling it. I mean, maybe he had gone too long without sleep and he just imagined what happened to him. I've never been in that situation, but it sounds scary to me. Out in the night, in the middle of nowhere, back in the primitive 20th century. Did they even have cell phones back then? I bet there was no service out in the swamps even if he had a phone on him. I bet it was dark, and I bet it was creepy. Probably not much traffic, all alone. My imagination might start playing tricks on me. I wouldn't want to be there alone. Heck, I'd probably be scared even being there with another person. Just the two of us against the whole world. Maybe Dad is right. Maybe he did overprotect me. The idea of him out doing that when he was my age, or maybe not even my age yet, it kind of makes me see him in a new light. Anyway, so my dad was driving through the swamps and he said out of nowhere, he suddenly saw a tall green Sasquatch in his headlights staring right back at him. He couldn't tell if it had walked into the headlights or what, but it was there and it was too close for him to be able to stop in time. Screaming, hitting the horn, and slamming on the brakes all at once, Dad said he braced for impact and he knew that big, green Bigfoot was going to end up splattered all over the front end of that truck. He said that the Bigfoot jumped up on the truck and the next thing you knew, he was staring right in the windshield at him, blocking his view of the road. My father told me that the conventional view of Bigfoot is just all wrong. He had much bigger eyes than they show on TV. He said that Bigfoot looked more like a giant slee stack than anything else. A greasy, wet slee stack. It had 3 fingers on each of its hands and 3 toes on each of its feet, he said. I think it had mange, he told me, because it seemed to be missing all or most of its hair. All of this had me a bit confused, and then a little tiny light blinked on over my tiny little brain. Where did you say this happened, Dad? I asked, putting the pieces together. Could it have been in South Carolina? Then I remembered that was one of the 3 states he mentioned as a possibility. Could you have been driving near Scape or Swamp? I asked. Is that a trucking road? Dad reminded me that he didn't really remember exactly where he was since he never made that trip ever again, and it had been a quarter of a century since. It might have been Scape or Swamp, but he wouldn't have known where he was driving through even that night, so he definitely wouldn't know now. I Googled and read him the story of the lizard man back in 1988, attacking that guy driving near Scape or Swamp in South Carolina. I told Dad I didn't think he saw a Bigfoot with mange. I think he saw the lizard man. That would explain why I looked more like a slee stack than a gorilla, he admitted. He told me that he thought I was right, that I probably was a lizard man after all. Then a few days ago I heard him telling one of my sister's friends about it, and he was back to calling it a big green Bigfoot, so whatever. But I still think it was a lizard man. Anyway, we left my father back in the mid-90s driving a semi down a lonely highway in the dark night in the middle of a swamp, and a lizard man suddenly leaped up onto his windshield. It was blocking my view of the road, my father continued. I would slow down to stop so that I didn't crash. Then it would try to climb around the side to come in my window, which was broken, so I couldn't roll it up more than halfway. I was like, wait, you had to slow the truck or crash, but when you slowed down, a 7-foot-tall feral slee stack was trying to crawl in the cab with you? Dad was like, yup. Only it was even scarier to actually be going through it than the way you described it. Dad told me how he would speed up and slow down and drive to the left and drive to the right, all trying to throw this greasy-looking lizard man off his truck. I asked him if he got a good look at the thing, and he said that it was all he could see. I asked him if he could give me any more detail than to say it looked like a slee stack. Dad has written 2 books, but both were academic and about mathematics. He doesn't really know how to add on details about real life. He just tends to solve for X and then get on to the next equation. But I saw him staring hard back into his memory for me, and it felt good to be there with him for the first time in a long while. Well, the eyes were large like a space alien, he said, and the teeth, they were long and pointed, but all sort of equal sized to each other, sort of like a fish. I guess in some ways his mouth really resembled that of a fish, but the head itself looked almost sort of human. It had 2 arms and 2 legs, and I saw it standing upright like a man in the road at first, he said. So that's why I thought it was a Bigfoot. It was too tall to be a human, and its teeth were too long as well. However, he said, thinking about it further, when it leaped up onto the windshield, it leaped like some kind of a frog. That's what it reminded me of when it did that, a frog, he said, chuckling. So how'd you get rid of it, Dad? I asked. He started chuckling again. Windshield wipers, he said, smiling. I grew even more skeptical. Dad, windshield wipers wouldn't be strong enough to knock a lizard man off a windshield. That's true, he agreed. But the windshield wiper fluid I squirted up on the glass made it slippery. And sure enough, the bugger lost his grip and fell off. We both laughed and I high-fived him. That was either a fast recovery or else maybe he really was telling me a true story. I honestly don't know if my father really had any of this happen to him, but he seems sincere about it. He's only ever lied to me before in the way parents do, like telling me the Easter Bunny was real and that sort of thing. So he might be lying about this if he thought it were for my own good. But he told me the story the way he would tell stories to his friends. He spoke to me as an adult, he made eye contact at points, and he sure looked like he was being serious. It did feel real when he was telling it, so maybe it really did happen. But if it did, I don't think that green bug-eyed monster that jumped like a frog onto his windshield was any kind of Bigfoot. After all, this was only around 7 years after the most famous lizard man sighting of all. Maybe my father really was in Scape or Swamp, and if he was, then I think my father saw a lizard man.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. If you have a scary experience you want to tell us about, you can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.